A perfect penthouse, a seemingly perfect marriage, and one quiet disappearance that changes everything. On Christmas morning, Clara Vance vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only an engagement ring and a haunting note: "Do not come looking for me." As journalist Ethan Cole begins to investigate, hidden secrets start to surface: betrayal, lies, and a powerful family slowly falling apart. Julian Vance believed he controlled every part of his life until the truth began to reveal itself. This story reminds us of one powerful lesson: silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the strength to walk away and begin again. If this story moved you, please support the channel with one like and one share to help us stay motivated to create more dramatic stories for you. Thanks for watching.
The nursery was silent, the Chicago skyline was a tapestry of cold light, and on the marble countertop of the kitchen lay her wedding band beside a note that would dismantle his empire. "You built this future, enjoy it alone." He was in a private jet to Aspen with his protege, while his pregnant wife uncovered everything: the five-star lodge, the custom diamond necklace, the woman he had promised a world that was already hers, but he never anticipated this. She didn't throw a vase. She didn't make a single call. She simply vanished with his heir before the first snow fell. And what she did next is the stuff of legend. If you know that a debt of betrayal is always paid in full, then like this video and follow along, because this story is for you. The nursery was perfect now. Ilara Sterling stood in the doorway, clutching a small, antique silver rattle. She had polished herself, her thumb, brushed over the smooth, cool metal where her son's initials were meant to be engraved. She whispered into the quiet, her voice fracturing on each word. "He didn't just steal our last Christmas together. He erased everything we were meant to be, and I was too blind to see any of it." But that crushing realization would come hours later. Our story begins on the morning of Christmas Eve, when Ilara still believed in the flawless life she shared with her husband, the Sterling penthouse. Perched atop a skyscraper in Chicago was an ode to minimalist wealth. Snow drifted past the floor-to-ceiling windows, dusting the city in a soft white glow. Simple, elegant garlands framed the panes, their silver ribbons the exact shade of charcoal. Arthur Sterling's brand consultant had deemed on brand inside. A 12-foot fir tree stood adorned with stark, geometric ornaments from their trips to Stockholm and Tokyo. Ilara, now 8 months pregnant, had been awake since sunrise. Using the quiet to orchestrate perfection, she had arranged a catered brunch from their favorite restaurant. She had wrapped his gifts in matte black paper. With silk cord, she'd even scheduled a call with their architect to finalize the plans for the nursery's expansion. Everything was under control. It always was. She was on a small, steadying stool, adjusting a silver star on the tree, when she heard him stride in. Arthur appeared, already in a tailored wool overcoat, his face set with purpose. His carbon fiber weekender bag was at his side. He looked sharp, decisive, and a million miles away. He always did. "You're leaving now?" Ilara asked, stepping down cautiously. "I thought the flight to Zurich wasn't until noon." He crossed the vast room and placed a dry kiss on her forehead. Not her lips. She felt the small sting of it, but let it go. "I managed to get on an earlier flight," he said. "The winter storm warnings are getting worse. Better not to risk it," she nodded. But a cold dread coiled in her stomach. Arthur never reacted to risk. He neutralized it with meticulous, calculated planning. This felt different, like haste. "Are you positive this merger couldn't wait?" she asked, her voice deliberately gentle. "It's our last holiday before the baby comes." "Arthur, they won't even notice, but we will." He sighed, a sound she recognized as the overture to an unmovable decision. "Ilara, you know what's at stake. This deal with Omnicorp is generational. If I close this, our family's legacy is set for 100 years. I'll be back on a chartered flight. Christmas night. I promise. She wanted to fight him. She wanted to say that she had put her own career as a leading art curator on hold for this family, that she had navigated months of exhaustion and anxiety alone, that she deserved to have her husband with her. But Alara Sterling didn't create problems, she solved them. She absorbed the impact, she made it all seamless. Fine, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Just be careful. Arthur gave her the disarming smile that had won over venture capitalists, and her own wary heart. He rested a hand on her swollen belly, his gaze softening into what she desperately believed was love. I will make this up to us. How does a month in the Maldives sound after he's born, just the three of us? I'll have my AI assistant plan. Everything she let herself believe him, letting the promise soothe her anxiety. It's okay. Go close the deal. He grabbed his wallet from a tray by the door. His new prototype phone, a sleek, unreleased model from his company, chimed in his pocket. He glanced at it, angling the screen instinctively away as he typed a quick response. It's just Aura, my assistant, he said. Confirming my transport, I have to go. I'll call you from the plane. She watched his retreat, hugging her stomach against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Outside Arthur, she called out as he reached the door. He turned. I love you. A shadow of impatience passed over his face. So brief, she almost missed it. Love you more? He replied, and the door closed behind him. Alara stood in the grand entryway for several minutes, listening to the soft hum of the private elevator. Descending, the silence of the penthouse felt immense. A vacuum pressing in on her, she went back to the living room. Straightening a single ornament on the tree, her own reflection stared back from the dark glass of the window. A woman who looked tired, strained, older than her 32 years. When had that happened? The baby gave a sudden, powerful kick, a little anchor in her sea of unease, and she walked toward the nursery, seeking refuge. Inside the nursery, the scent of new linen and chamomile filled the air. She ran a hand along the warm wood of the crib. Your father has to go, change the world, little one, she whispered. But don't you worry, we're going to have the most magical Christmas. Just us. She tried to make it a statement of fact, but it sounded fragile, like a question. Her gaze fell on a digital photo frame on the bookshelf from their wedding 3 years ago, Arthur. Looking at her as if she were the most brilliant thing he had ever acquired. And Alara, looking at him as if he were her entire universe. She had believed it. With every fiber of her being, she thought she had finally found a safe harbor. Her tablet, lying on a changing table, lit up with a notification. She expected it was Arthur, saying he'd arrived at the airport. It was from her friend Chloe, the godmother-to-be. Merry Christmas Eve. How's my favorite little dumpling doing? Alara smiled and typed a reply, kicking up a storm. Arthur had to fly to Zurich for a last-minute merger. Chloe's response was almost immediate, a tech merger in Zurich on Christmas Eve. The bluntness of the question made Alara's breath catch. She typed back quickly, yeah, a massive deal with Omnicorp. You know how he is? Chloe's reply was just a single word, suspicious. Call me if you need anything. Alara put the tablet down and began refolding tiny onesies, the soft, organic cotton, a small comfort against her rising panic. She inhaled the calm scent of the nursery and pushed the doubt down. It was Christmas Eve. Her husband was closing a deal. He loved her. She chanted the words internally, like a mantra. Everything's fine, everything is fine. Everything is fine. But as the afternoon bled into evening and the city began to glow below, a voice deep inside her knew it was a lie. Christmas Eve descended with a heavy, profound silence, the penthouse. Once her sanctuary, now felt like a sterile showroom. Every tick of the clock echoed the emptiness Alara had texted Arthur once. but the message remained undelivered. She told herself it was the international flight. She told herself he was busy. She told herself lies to quiet the screaming intuition in her soul beside her. On the sofa was his old phone, the one he had replaced with the new prototype last week. He must have forgotten it in his rush. She picked it up, intending to plug it in for him. When her own tablet on the coffee table chimed, it was a notification from Aura, their home's integrated AI system, the same one Arthur used to manage his life. It read, Arthur Sterling's itinerary update. She tapped it, assuming it was a flight status update, but a full itinerary filled the screen, synced from Arthur's personal calendar. It was a 5-day reservation at the Aspen Ridge, a famously exclusive ski resort. A private dinner for two was confirmed for that evening at 8 p.m., followed by a couple's massage the next morning. Aspen, not Zurich. Her mind struggled to process the information. The room seemed to tilt. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. It's a mistake. It has to be a system error, a crossed signal. It had to be anything but this. With hands that trembled, she scrolled down the itinerary. Her breath held tight. The AI, programmed for ultimate efficiency, had linked all related transactions for the trip. There was a charge from earlier that week at a high-end Chicago jeweler for a custom-designed snowflake pendant. Next to it was a gift note that had been transcribed into the order details for my winter star Chloe. I love you, and then she saw it a wire transfer from a private account, sent just last month, as a down payment on a penthouse apartment in the same Aspen complex, leased for 6 months in the name of Chloe Dubois. Her fingers went numb. She typed the name into her search browser. Chloe Dubois, Aura Dynamics. The first result was a Business Journal feature article titled The New Face of Tech. Chloe Dubois, Aura's VP of Strategic Partnerships. The photo showed a fiercely intelligent-looking woman with sharp, dark hair standing beside Arthur at a company gala. He was looking at her with a raw, unguarded admiration that Alara hadn't felt aimed at her in a very long time. A glacial coldness seeped into Alara's bones. She found Chloe's professional social media page. It was unlocked. Her latest post, from 2 hours ago, was a selfie. She was on a private jet, smiling and holding a glass of champagne in the background. A man's arm was visible. The cuff of his shirt and the designer watch on his wrist were unmistakably Arthur's. The caption was a single, devastating word: promotion, the perfect, curated life she had sacrificed everything for. Didn't just have a crack in it. It was a smoking crater. Clara was proofing the article as a favor, a pre-release look at the magazine feature on her husband, Arthur Vance, Boston's most celebrated architect. He'd scoffed when she'd pointed out the custom sapphire necklace in his design portfolio months ago, calling it a failed commission. Now she zoomed in on a high-resolution photo of his sleek new office. In the reflection on a framed blueprint, she saw it. Arthur kissing a striking brunette who was wearing that exact necklace. Have you ever seen something that instantly rewrote your reality? Drop a rewrite in the comments if you get it. The chamomile tea on her nightstand grew cold as Clara stared. The digital image, a perfect, glossy testament to her husband's betrayal. The photo was a key that unlocked a hidden world. A password she'd seen him type once, the name of his childhood street, gave her access to a private cloud drive. It was a meticulously organized archive of another life. Flight confirmations to Zurich, receipts for lavish dinners, and folders of intimate photos that made her feel like a trespasser in her own marriage. One email thread felt like a physical blow. It was from 2 weeks ago, just before the city's holiday gala. Serena had written, "Are you ever going to tell her it's over?" Arthur's reply was brutally efficient. After the new building launch. I need the good press. She doesn't have a clue. Clara traced the words on the screen until they lost all meaning. She doesn't have a clue. The penthouse at the seaport, the lies constructed as carefully as one of his skyscrapers. Her hands shook as she dialed Arthur's number. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice tight with annoyance. Clara, can this be quick? I'm in the middle of a press event. She could hear the distinct clink of champagne glasses and a woman's throaty laugh that was becoming horribly familiar. Who are you with, Arthur? She asked, her voice thin as ice. Investors, he snapped. Stop being so possessive, Clara. I'll see you tomorrow. Arthur, we need to talk. It's important. A long, exasperated sigh came down the line. Whatever you think is important can wait. I'm with the board right now. More important than your wife, who is 7 months pregnant, she wanted to shout. More important than the son you claimed to want so badly? But the words were stuck, choked by a sudden wave of nausea. She heard the woman's laugh again, closer to the phone this time, and a vital piece of her own hope fractured. Look, I have to run, Arthur said. Happy New Year? The line went dead. Clara sat in the profound silence of their Beacon Hill brownstone. The silver and gold decorations for their New Year's party shimmered, completely oblivious to the quiet devastation of her world. Then, a cold resolve settled over her, and she stood up. She climbed the floating staircase to the second floor and pushed open the nursery door. The minimalist crib he'd designed stood under a mobile of geometric brass birds. This room, a sanctuary of anticipation for their child, now felt like a cold, empty museum exhibit. She sank to the plush carpet, hugging her knees to her chest as the tears finally came, scalding, silent, and overwhelming. She cried for the future she had so carefully curated, for the man she thought was her partner, for the life that was now disintegrating before her eyes. When the grief receded, it left behind something hard and clear in its place. Not anger, not despair. It was purpose. She picked up her phone and called Isabel. Her best friend answered on the first ring. Clara? You okay? Clara's voice was shockingly steady, a stark contrast to the storm inside her. I need you. Arthur isn't the man I thought he was. Not even close. Isabel arrived at the historic brownstone before the first light of New Year's Eve, her car filled with an overnight bag and her financial analyst's mind already calculating risk. Neither of them had slept. They sat at the enormous marble island in the kitchen, the rest of the city still asleep, their conversation a hushed, urgent whisper. As the gray dawn broke over the Boston Common, Isabel's tone was sharp and focused. Walk me through it. All of it. Clara turned her laptop around. She had used the sleepless hours to build an arsenal of proof, downloading encrypted financial statements, screenshotting every damning email, and creating a timeline of his duplicity. This wasn't the New Year's Eve she had envisioned, but it would be the beginning of her new life. Isabel scrolled through the data, her jaw tightening with each file she opened, the lease on the Seaport penthouse, the wire transfers to an offshore account, the messages that detailed a 5-year plan that didn't include Clara at all. Finally, she met Clara's eyes. This is a catastrophe, Clara, a planned one. I know. No, you don't, Isabel countered. These transfers, he's systematically moving and hiding liquid assets. If my hunch is right, he's planning to completely erase his domestic financial footprint. You need to act immediately. Clara wrapped her hands around her cold mug. What does that mean? Isabel leaned forward. Men like Arthur, with his kind of wealth and public profile, they don't just leave, they execute a strategy. By the time the wife is served with papers, the money has vanished. The accounts are frozen, and she's left fighting for scraps with a lawyer she can't afford. We don't have a prenup, Clara whispered. He said it felt too cynical. Isabel scoffed, a sharp, humorless sound. Of course he did. A prenup would have forced him to disclose all his assets from the start. It would have given you a baseline. Without it, he thinks he can hide the majority of it. The good news is, you are entitled to half of everything, but only if we can find it and prove it's marital property. Clara looked at the evidence she'd compiled. So, what's my move? Isabel's reply was swift and certain. You get out. Tonight. Before he comes home and finds out you know. Get out? Where would I go? My family has a ski chalet in Stowe. It's shut down for the season. It's completely off-grid, no mail service, nothing connecting it to you. Only we know about it. Clara shook her head, her hand protectively covering her stomach. I can't just disappear. It's not an abduction when you are the expectant mother and no custody order exists. You have the legal right to travel. What you don't have, Clara, is time to waste. The statement settled in the heavy silence of the designer kitchen. Clara looked at the custom Italian fixtures she had chosen, at the integrated wine fridge and the Gaggenau cooktop. She had tried to breathe life and warmth into this house, to make it a home, but it had always been his showpiece. If I go, she said, her voice barely a whisper, there's no going back. It all comes crashing down. Isabel placed a firm hand on her arm. Do you really want to go back? To a man who has built your entire life on a foundation of lies, who has another woman living in a penthouse that your joint money paid for? Clara thought of Arthur's handsome face in the reflection, of the necklace he'd lied about, of his dismissive tone on the phone, treating her and their unborn son like a temporary inconvenience. No, she said, the words solidifying in her throat. I don't want to go back. Then let's get to work. They moved with quiet purpose. Clara packed only the essentials, following Isabel's instructions: passport, birth certificate, social security card, the baby's ultrasound prints, her grandmother's antique locket, the only valuable she owned that Arthur hadn't given her. She left behind the designer wardrobe. She left behind the curated art. She packed only the pieces of her own history. Isabel managed the logistics. A large cash withdrawal from a personal account Arthur didn't monitor. An untraceable prepaid phone from a corner store. A handwritten map that used state highways and back roads, avoiding tolls and major interstates. As Clara hauled the last bag to her car, she stopped at the entrance to the main living area. The opulent New Year's decorations shimmered. 2 stockings, one with her initial and one with his, hung from the imported marble fireplace. The hostess gifts she'd bought sat wrapped in elegant silver paper. She walked back to the kitchen, slid the heavy wedding band and engagement ring from her finger, and placed them on the stark white island. Then she took a page from a notepad and wrote 5 words. A picture is worth 1,000 lies. She put the note beside the rings, then walked out, not looking back once. Her son shifted inside her, a gentle flutter that felt like a promise. It's time for a new design, little one, she whispered, her hand on her belly. Just for us. She got into her car and looked at Isabel, who was watching from the doorway. You're sure about the chalet? Isabel gave a decisive nod. I'll message you the location on the new phone. Talk to no one. I'll start making calls first thing Tuesday morning. Clara nodded. Thank you for this, Izzy. You can thank me when you're sipping tea in Vermont, safe and sound. Clara started the car, its engine a low rumble in the quiet morning. She took a final look at the brownstone, a perfect, historic facade that had hidden a modern ruin. Then she pulled away from the curb and headed north, driving into the cold New Year's Eve dawn, leaving behind a life that was an elaborate fake and taking with her the only thing that was real. Behind her, a light snow began to fall, dusting the street and covering her tire tracks. erasing her from the picture as if she had been nothing but a ghost. Arthur Vance returned to his Beacon Hill home on New Year's Day, to a house that was dark and cold. The first sign something was wrong was the mail. The holiday cards and magazines were still in the mail slot, not neatly stacked on the hall table, as Clara always did. It was one of those tiny, orderly habits of hers that he found both comforting and, at times, suffocating. But tonight, the disarray felt ominous, and a cold dread began to coil in his stomach as he parked his car. The trip from Aspen had been turbulent. The private jet had hit rough weather over the mountains, and Arthur was nursing a hangover while thinking about the weekend. Serena had been furious when he'd insisted on flying back today. She'd wanted to stay through the week, but perception was 90% of reality, and Arthur Vance was a master architect of his own public image. He unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the silence. The elaborate New Year's decorations were still up, their metallic sheen catching the faint streetlights from outside. "Clara?" he called out, his voice echoing in the hall. "I'm back." Nothing answered him but the low hum of the sub-zero fridge. He shut the heavy oak door to his study, the silence of the penthouse pressing in. Everything was in its place, the minimalist furniture arranged with geometric precision. But his gaze snagged on the polished concrete counter in the kitchen. The keys to his vintage Aston Martin, his most prized possession, were sitting next to a single, sleek server drive. With a growing sense of dread, Arthur plugged the drive into his laptop. It was wiped clean, except for one encrypted file. Anya.dat. The name hit him like a physical blow. He dropped the drive and sprinted up the floating staircase. The nursery, with its soft gray walls and state-of-the-art smart crib, was silent, perfect, and devastatingly empty. Their California king bed was flawlessly made, the cool linen on her side of the bed undisturbed. There was no sign of his wife, Isabel, who was 7 months pregnant and should have been resting. He stormed into the sprawling walk-in closet. Her rugged, nondescript go-bag was gone, while her designer luggage remained untouched. The safe, where she kept the heirlooms from her grandmother, stood open and empty. A cold knot tightened in his gut. He grabbed his phone, his thumb hesitating over her name before he called. It went straight to her encrypted voicemail service. A second call yielded the same result. His breathing grew shallow as he scrolled to his mother's contact. Genevieve answered instantly, her voice as crisp as a new stock certificate. "Arthur, this is a highly inconvenient time." "What has happened?" "She's gone," he choked out, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "Isabel," he specified. "She took her heirlooms and she's just gone." There was a pause, and then Genevieve's tone became dangerously quiet. "Define gone." "I got home from the office, and she wasn't here. She left the keys to the Aston and a wiped hard drive on the counter. The only thing on it was a file named after you-know-who. And our son, of course." "I see," Genevieve said, her voice laced with impending fury. "What did you do, Arthur?" "Nothing. I don't know why she would. Do not insult my intelligence. I am not your pregnant, trusting wife." Arthur sank onto the edge of the bed, dropping his head into his hands. He thought of the burner phones, the secure cloud storage, the digital breadcrumbs he was so certain he had erased. "She knows," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "about Anya." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. When Genevieve finally spoke, her voice was arctic. "You fool. You arrogant, short-sighted fool. I warned you that AI consultant was a complication we didn't need. It was contained," he argued, his voice weak. "Obviously not." "Do you have any idea where Isabel might have run to?" Arthur's mind spun. Her family was in Europe, and she'd drifted from most of her old university friends. Clara Reed, her best friend from grad school, but he hadn't heard Isabel mention her in years. Maybe Clara, he suggested. They were like sisters back at Berkeley. Then you will contact this woman and find out what she knows. I will engage my own resources. We have to get ahead of this, before it becomes a media catastrophe for the company. Arthur muttered an affirmation, though his mother couldn't hear it. A different feeling was now overriding his panic, something hot and sharp. It was rage. How could she do this? How could she take his son, his heir, and just vanish, without giving him the chance to explain, to manage the situation? He had given her a life beyond imagining, a penthouse overlooking the Golden Gate, a name that commanded respect throughout Silicon Valley. And this was her response? "Mother," he said, his voice hardening into something cold and sharp. "Find her. I don't care what the price is." Genevieve's response was immediate and confident. "I have specialists for exactly this kind of problem. It will be handled with absolute discretion." After hanging up, Arthur stood alone in the nursery. The ceiling was a custom projection of the night sky. The expensive, self-rocking crib sat there, a monument to a legacy that had just been stolen from him. The air smelled of new paint and betrayal. He took out his phone and made another call. Anya picked up, her voice a low, seductive hum. "Darling, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. My schedule just cleared up." Arthur's voice was flat, empty of any affection. "She knows. She took the baby and left." He heard a sharp gasp on the other end of the line. "Oh, Arthur, what are we going to do? You are going to do nothing. You will remain completely silent and allow me to handle this. Do you understand me?" "Yes, darling." "Of course. Whatever you need." He disconnected the call before she could finish. He walked to the automated bar in the great room and ordered a double of a rare Japanese whiskey, downing it in one smooth, burning swallow. Isabel actually thought she could hide from him. She believed she could take his son and disappear, as if he were some common man to be discarded. She was profoundly mistaken. Arthur Sterling did not lose. Not in venture capital, not in coding, and certainly not in his own family. He picked up his phone one last time, dialing a number reserved for the most extreme situations. The contact specialized in finding people who had vanished from the digital world. "I require your services," he said. "My wife has disappeared with my unborn son. I want her physical location within 24 hours. The man on the other end quoted a price that would have bankrupted a small country." Arthur didn't even blink. "Done. Use any and all available methods." He ended the call and stared out the massive window, the lights of San Francisco glittering below like a circuit board he owned. She was about to learn a valuable lesson. The cabin near Lake Tahoe was at the end of an unplowed private road, buried under a fresh blanket of snow. The drifts were so high that Isabel had to abandon her SUV and hike the final 200 yards through the deep powder. By the time she forced the frozen key into the lock and fell inside, she was shaking from the cold and sheer exhaustion. But the cabin was a fortress. It was safe. Clara's family had owned it for generations. It was primitive, with no Wi-Fi and spotty cell reception at best, but it was well stocked and secure. A shed was piled high with firewood, and the pantry was full enough to last her through the spring. Isabel threw the heavy deadbolt and sagged against the rough-hewn door, one hand protectively on her stomach. The following 3 days passed in a blur of fear, sleep, and adrenaline. She was on constant alert, jumping at every groan of the old cabin's timbers. She kept the blackout curtains pulled shut and checked the locks obsessively every night. Slowly, however, as the profound quiet of the wilderness settled around her, a strange sense of calm began to emerge. On the fourth morning, she felt the baby give a strong, decisive kick. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was simply ready. Clara arrived that afternoon in a massive 4x4, its tires churning through the snow. The back was filled with groceries and a shielded briefcase. She stomped the snow off her boots on the porch and pulled Isabel into a tight, fierce hug. "You look like you've been through a war," she said, "but your eyes are finally clear." "I feel clearer," Isabel confessed. "It's strange. I thought I would completely fall apart. Being up here by myself." Clara set the briefcase on the rustic dining table. "That's because you've been falling apart for the last 5 years, Izzy. You were just too busy playing the part of the perfect tech mogul's wife to notice." As Isabel brewed some tea, Clara opened a secure laptop and laid out a digital nightmare. She had been digging for weeks. There were registration documents for phantom tech startups Isabel had never known existed, and transaction logs of cryptocurrency transfers to anonymous wallets. It was a dizzying maze of financial deception that made his affair feel like a footnote. "He's been laundering company profits into untraceable crypto assets for at least 3 years," Clara said, pointing to a complex flowchart. "These shell companies are designed to fail, to look like bad investments. If he were to serve you divorce papers, he'd claim his net worth has been decimated. You'd walk away with next to nothing." Isabel looked at a summary page. "What kind of numbers are we talking about? A low estimate? 40 to 50 million that he has systematically hidden from you and his company's shareholders." The amount was staggering. She knew Arthur was ruthless in his business dealings, but she had never suspected this scale of criminality. "And it gets worse," Clara said softly. "I looked into Anya Petrova. She isn't just some consultant he was sleeping with. One of his shell companies was the seed investor in her firm 2 years ago." "What does that mean?" "It means she wasn't a distraction, Izzy. She was part of the plan. He was building his next life, waiting for the right time to cut you loose." A fresh wave of sickness washed over Isabel. Every fundraiser, every tech conference she had dutifully attended, he had been a master illusionist. He had used her reputation and her trust as cover for his grand deception. "What is our play?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "We build a firewall," Clara replied. "We gather all the proof, and when he finally comes for you, we don't just sue him. We expose him to the SEC and the world." For the first time since that terrible night, Isabel felt something more powerful than fear. It was a cold, precise fury that sharpened her mind. She looked at the damning financial records, then at her brilliant, loyal friend. "Tell me everything I need to know." They worked for the next 18 hours straight. Clara, a top forensic accountant, walked her through the intricacies of blockchain tracing and corporate malfeasance. Isabel, with her architect's mind for complex systems, absorbed it all, her intellect coming alive after years of dormancy. By the time they finally paused, the sun was rising over the snow-covered peaks, and Isabel understood that her old life was truly over. A new one, however, had just begun. Maya stirred the steaming cartons of pad thai on her tiny kitchen counter, while Chloe stared out the window at the endless Brooklyn rain. As they ate from the containers, the silence felt heavy, but not unkind. "I thought it would feel different," Chloe admitted, her voice barely there. "Leaving him, leaving that life, but I just feel hollow." "You don't miss him," Maya corrected gently. "You miss the man you thought he was, the future you were so sure you were building." Chloe nodded slowly. "I just keep replaying things, all the little inconsistencies I chose to ignore. Every time I told myself I was just being paranoid. That's not your fault. He's a con artist. That's his gift." They ate for a moment, the only sound the rain against the window pane. "You know he's looking for you, right?" Maya said finally. His mother has connections that are frankly terrifying. The money, the influence. They aren't just going to let you disappear. I know. Are you scared? Chloe considered it. She pictured Ethan's face, the chilling calmness in his eyes when he was angry. She thought of Isabella, who saw her as little more than a vessel for the Blackwood legacy. Yes, she whispered. But I'm more terrified of what happens if they find me and my baby. Good, Maya said, her voice firm. Hold on to that feeling. Outside, the rain streaked down the glass, blurring the city lights. Chloe placed a hand protectively over her stomach. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't orbit around Ethan Blackwood. It was a frightening, unknown world, but it also felt like taking a full breath after being submerged for years. She whispered it into the darkness of the small apartment, a vow to herself and her unborn child. We're going to be okay. And for the first time, she thought it might be true. A series of sharp, authoritative knocks on the door shattered the 3 o'clock morning silence. It had been almost a week since she'd fled, and the old apartment building should have been quiet. Instead, the sound echoed in the hallway like a judgment. The rhythmic knocking continued, impatient and loud. Chloe slipped out of bed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cold linoleum floor sent a jolt through her bare feet as she crept to the door, peering through the peephole. 2 men in dark, expensive suits stood in the dimly lit hallway. They weren't cops, but they radiated a cold authority. Oh no, please no, not already. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone as she tried to call Maya, who was on a night shift at the hospital. The call went straight to voicemail. Chloe tried again, her thumb trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. It was useless. She looked through the peephole again, and her blood ran cold. They were stepping aside to let 2 more figures approach. Ethan and his mother, Isabella. Their shadows loomed large and menacing in the narrow hall. She had seconds, maybe a minute at most. She backed away from the door, frantically searching for an escape that didn't exist. There was no fire escape, no adjoining door, no way out of the 4th-floor apartment that didn't lead directly past the 4 people who had come for her. Think, Chloe, think. Her mind raced. She could scream. They would say she was hysterical. She could barricade the door. They would have security break it down and call it proof of her instability. She was trapped. A sharp, commanding knock rattled the door again, making her jump. Chloe, it's Ethan. Open the door. Dr. Finch is with me. Chloe stood frozen in the middle of the small living room, her hands wrapped around her stomach. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She could only be captured. The knock came again, harder this time. Chloe, we know you're in there. We're worried about you. Don't make this more difficult. She began the long, agonizing walk to the door, each footstep a final, crushing surrender. With a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, she slid the chain and turned the lock. The door swung open. Ethan Blackwood stepped inside, his handsome face arranged into a perfect mask of worried concern. Behind him, his mother, Isabella, swept in, a cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes as cold and gray as the city sky. With them was a man Chloe didn't recognize, carrying a leather briefcase and watching her with a calm, disturbingly clinical expression. Did you truly imagine we wouldn't find you? Isabella said, her voice a low, condescending purr. Hiding in your sister's apartment in Brooklyn? My son's security consultant had your location in less than 12 hours. 12? Did you honestly believe you could win this little game of hide and seek? Chloe instinctively took a step back, shielding her belly. How did you... Connections, darling. The right connections can find anyone. Isabella's smile was thin and sharp. I've filed for an emergency hearing, Ethan said, his tone infuriatingly gentle. Dr. Finch is here to perform an evaluation. We're here to get you some help. An evaluation? What are you talking about? I haven't been served anything. One of the men from the hallway stepped forward, holding out a thick legal envelope. His voice was flat. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband has petitioned the court for an emergency evaluation, citing grave concerns for your mental state and the welfare of your unborn child. You are hereby ordered to attend a hearing in Manhattan Family Court in 48 hours. My mental state? Chloe's voice trembled with fury. That's absurd. I am this baby's mother. A mother who emptied a joint savings account and fled in the middle of the night, Isabella interjected, her voice like ice. Who left a hysterical note and refused all attempts at contact. That doesn't sound like a stable woman, Chloe. It sounds like someone having a complete mental breakdown. I found out you were cheating on me, Chloe finally screamed, the words ripping from her throat. With Sophia, I know about the necklace. I know about the trips you took while I was at home sick. I know you've been lying about our entire marriage. I left to protect my child from you. Ethan didn't even flinch. His expression remained one of deep, sorrowful concern. You see, Doctor? The paranoia, the wild accusations. This is precisely the pattern of behavior I described. The man with the briefcase finally spoke, his voice unnervingly smooth. Mrs. Blackwood, I am Dr. Finch, a forensic psychiatrist. Your husband has retained my services to provide the court with an objective, professional opinion. The wisest course of action would be for you to cooperate. Let's just go home and handle this privately, Chloe, Ethan pleaded. Chloe's gaze shifted from Ethan's feigned sincerity to Isabella's unconcealed contempt, to the doctor's impassive face. She looked for a single ounce of doubt, of compassion, of belief in her. There was nothing. It was a united front of immense power, a perfectly constructed story where she was already the villain. What choice do I have? She whispered. You have 48 hours to appear in court. The process server repeated like a machine. If you fail to appear, a warrant can be issued. Your husband will likely be granted temporary guardianship of the child upon its birth. Chloe felt the worn floorboards of her sister's apartment sway beneath her, as if the whole world was tilting on its axis. The life she had tried to reclaim, the safety she had run toward, the fragile, desperate hope for a new start, it all dissolved in the stuffy hallway air. Isabella glided toward her. Her perfume, a scent Chloe once admired, now smelled toxic. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss. Come home. Play the role. Let us take care of you. If you turn this into a public spectacle, I will spend the next 10 years and $20 million to make sure you only see your child on supervised visits. Is that what you want for your son? Chloe looked down at her belly, where her son was oblivious to the war being fought for his future. To the Blackwoods, he wasn't a baby. He was an heir, a piece of their dynasty to be managed. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run down the hall and beg a neighbor for help. But Isabella was right. They had the money, the lawyers, and the narrative. They had it all. All right, she said, the words scraping her throat raw. I'll come back. Of course, we knew you'd see sense, Eleanor said, her smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. You were always such a pragmatic young woman. As the lawyers began to murmur about clauses and stipulations, as Arthur signaled for his driver to be on standby, as his mother looked at Clara's pregnant belly like it was a corporate asset she was acquiring, Clara made a vow to herself. This was not a negotiation. She had been ambushed in her own home, but the fight for her child had just been declared, and she would shatter their gilded world into a million pieces before she would ever surrender. The Sterling Tower was a monument to financial power, all bronze and dark marble, where the afternoon light struggled to pierce the tinted glass. Inside, the hushed sound of immense wealth being managed filled the air. Clara sat on a leather couch in a 40th floor conference room, her fingers clenched so tightly Her knuckles were white. Her lawyer, Marcus, sat beside her, his face a mask of controlled fury as he scrolled through a file on his laptop. "This is a tactical strike," Marcus hissed, his voice a low growl. "Judge Peterson, the man assigned to your case, sits on the board of the Metropolitan Museum's Sterling Wing. He's had dinner with Arthur's father every Christmas for the last decade. He was legally obligated to recuse himself." "He won't," Clara replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "They've planned for every contingency. We have to file the injunction. It's going to be rejected. After that, we appeal." "With what funds, Isla? He's locked you out of everything." Marcus looked at his client, at her ashen, defiant face, and for the first time, he felt his own professional armor crack. He was realizing they weren't just confronting a husband, they were confronting a dynasty. The doors to the family court swung open. A clerk called their names. Isla got to her feet on unsteady legs and moved toward the chamber where her future would be dismantled. The courtroom was more opulent than she'd anticipated, paneled in dark, imposing mahogany. Arthur sat at the far table, flanked by a woman with a reputation for merciless litigation, Camilla Thorne. Arthur refused to meet Isla's gaze. He stared forward, the perfect image of a wounded, concerned spouse. Positioned in the gallery right behind him was Serafina, observing with the calm intensity of a hawk watching its prey. And next to her, in a crisp, stylish blazer that made her look both authoritative and striking, was the woman who carried his child. The sight of her, in that room, was like a punch to the gut. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Albright." The judge emerged, a man with a shock of silver hair and an expression of bored authority. He offered a curt, familiar nod toward Arthur's table before his gaze swept dismissively over Isla and Marcus. "We are convened today to hear the emergency motion concerning the welfare of the minor children, Noah and Lily Sterling." He glanced at Camilla Thorne. "Mrs. Thorne, you may proceed." Camilla rose, her posture exuding absolute control. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Arthur Sterling, is present today due to a profound and horrifying concern for his children. On March 5th, his wife, Isla Sterling, abandoned their Beacon Hill home in the dead of night, taking the toddlers to an undisclosed location and cutting off all communication. Isla fought the urge to scream that the truth was in the architectural blueprints for a home not meant for her, the proof of his deception, his manipulation, his betrayal. But Marcus's hand on her arm was a silent, firm command. "Not now." Mrs. Thorne continued without a pause, lifting a bound report. "We have also secured a preliminary psychological evaluation from Dr. Alistair Finch, who is ready to affirm that Mrs. Sterling's behavior aligns with a significant prenatal psychological breakdown, suggesting paranoid delusions and a potential danger to the children's well-being." Isla leaned forward, whispering frantically to Marcus. "I had a 5-minute conversation with that man at a fundraiser once in my life." "I know," he murmured back. "We'll challenge it." But when Marcus stood to object, Judge Albright brushed it aside with a careless wave. The evaluation was sought by a worried husband. "Your objection is noted for the record, counsel." The next hour became a distorted blur of legal maneuvers and fabricated narratives. Serafina Dubois took the stand, not as a witness, but as a star performer. She identified herself as the head architect at Sterling Properties, and then began to construct a story of Isla's slide into what she termed frightening emotional instability over the past year. She became incredibly suspicious, Serafina stated, her tone a masterclass in professional sympathy. She started inventing scenarios about Mr. Sterling that were completely detached from reality. I personally witnessed her having several distressing episodes at company functions. Isla stared at the woman who had shared her husband's bed, who was now committing perjury to steal her children, and a chilling numbness seeped into her bones. When Isla's lawyer, Marcus, tried to present the blueprints of the secret home as evidence of the affair, Judge Albright stopped him cold. "This is a hearing about the children's immediate safety, counselor, not a domestic drama. Mr. Sterling's private affairs are not on trial here. Your Honor, with all due respect, his calculated deceit is directly pertinent to his character and his fitness as a parent. The objection is sustained. Move along, counselor." But there was nowhere else to go. Every document Isla had discovered, every bit of proof, was either thrown out as inadmissible or simply ignored. Every argument Marcus attempted to make was shut down with brutal efficiency. It was terrifyingly obvious that the decision had been made long before they had ever entered the courtroom. The ruling was handed down with surgical speed. "Based on the testimony and documentation provided," Judge Albright announced, "I am granting temporary sole physical custody of the minor children, Noah and Lily Sterling, to their father, Mr. Arthur Sterling. Mrs. Sterling will be permitted supervised visitation twice weekly, contingent upon a comprehensive psychological assessment." "No," Isla breathed, getting to her feet, swaying. "No, you can't do this. He's lying. Every single one of them is lying. Mrs. Sterling, compose yourself, or I will have you escorted from my courtroom." "Please," she pleaded, her voice cracking apart. "Please, they're just babies. I'm their mother." But the bailiffs were already advancing, and Arthur was standing up, and his mother, Eleanor, was already moving toward the twins in their carriers. Isla could only stand there, frozen, as her entire existence was carried away by the same people who had systematically destroyed it. Lily glanced back over Eleanor's shoulder, her little face a portrait of confusion, her tiny fingers reaching out for her mama. Isla crumpled against Marcus, a sound of pure, primal anguish tearing from her lungs, a sound that was barely human. She had been defeated. They had triumphed. They had seized everything, and she had been utterly helpless to stop them. The air in the roadside motel room was heavy with the stench of cheap cleaner and regret. The wallpaper curled away from the walls like old, dry leaves, and the carpet was a tapestry of stains Isla chose not to examine. A large, faint watermark on the ceiling above the bed resembled a ghost of a country she would now never see. But the room was only $60 a night, and her supply of cash had shrunk to precisely $451. It had been 1 month since that day in court. 1 month of hollow, supervised meetings in cold, impersonal rooms under harsh, fluorescent lighting, and sterile community centers where she was allowed to hold her own son for 2 hours, while a stranger, hired by her husband, documented every word, every hug. 3 weeks of sleeping in her car after he locked her out. 3 weeks of living on stale gas station coffee and protein bars, desperately trying to map a new life when every road was blocked. Marcus's legal team was terrifyingly swift. They had used her erratic pregnancy hormones to justify freezing their joint assets. They had her barred from their waterfront mansion in Medina, claiming it was a corporate property essential to his business dealings. They had successfully spun her panicked drive to her parents' home as a reckless endangerment of their son, proof of her unstable judgment. They had systematically demolished every foundation of the life she'd known, piece by piece, leaving only wreckage, and that afternoon delivered the most devastating assault yet. Ava sat on the lumpy guest bed, staring at the legal notice her lawyer had just forwarded. The email glowed on her phone screen, its contents laid out on the cracked display like evidence in a fatal crime. A crucial witness, the personal assistant at Arthur's firm, had recanted her entire story. In a new sworn affidavit, she now claimed that Isla Sterling had attempted to blackmail her into fabricating false claims of infidelity against her husband. The statement was impenetrable, expertly written, and completely ruinous. He got to her, Marcus had said on the phone, the exhaustion thick in his voice. I have no idea what he threatened her with, Isla, but it was enough. She was our only real chance to prove premeditated character assassination. What about changing the venue? Denied. Judge Albright is remaining on the case, and the judicial ethics complaint we filed against him has just disappeared. His influence is too deep, Isla. I have never witnessed a case so thoroughly controlled. So, what do we do now? The silence that followed on the other end of the line felt like a physical weight. I don't know. I have no more moves to make. I am so sorry. Isla had hung up and simply sat, trapped in a silence that felt more solid than concrete. Through the grimy window, life went on as if her world hadn't just ended. Trucks rumbled down the highway, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. A neon sign for a nearby bar sputtered and blinked, promising cold beer and a game on the TV. Somewhere out there, someone was living a normal life, worrying about normal things, tucking their child into bed without being surveilled by a stranger. She picked up the TV remote, her thumb clicking aimlessly through channels she wasn't seeing. And then, a local news segment froze her blood in her veins. Boston's philanthropic leaders. The story was about Arthur, standing at a podium at a press event, the logo for his real estate empire emblazoned behind him. He looked charming, powerful, and utterly unscathed by the chaos he had engineered. His designer suit was impeccable, his smile confident. He looked like a man who had never experienced a single moment of hardship in his life. And standing just beside him was Serafina Dubois, her hand resting possessively on a small but obvious baby bump beneath her couture dress. She was glowing, radiant with the serene happiness of a woman who had just won everything. The reporter's voiceover said, "Real estate mogul Arthur Sterling with his partner and lead architect, Serafina Dubois, who are expecting their first child together." Isla heard the words again in her head. Their first child, as if Noah and Lily had been completely and utterly erased. She felt like a footnote in the epic of Arthur Lexington, when he was supposed to be the center of hers. She imagined her son and daughter, Ben and Lily, asleep in some guest wing of his family's cold, sprawling estate, tended to by strangers, not by their mother. Her mind replayed the 2 hours she was granted each week, a supervised, hollow performance that was never, ever enough. For a moment, she considered just letting the darkness win. Her phone buzzed, a sharp crack in her spiraling misery. Private number. She nearly let it go. What else could it be? More awful news? Another attorney explaining how hopeless her case was? Just more evidence that the world was sculpted for men like Arthur, and she was merely a tenant he could evict from his life. But a strange impulse made her slide her thumb across the screen. Am I speaking with Clara Lexington? The voice was a woman's, hushed and cautious, with a slight digital distortion, as if the call was being routed through multiple layers. Who is this? My name is not important. Not right now. What I have for you is, look, if you're another journalist digging for dirt, you're wasting your time. I have nothing to say. I'm not a reporter, Mrs. Lexington, the woman replied, and the formal title sent a chill across Clara's skin. I'm one of Arthur Lexington's survivors. Clara's breath hitched. She gripped the phone, her knuckles turning bone white. What are you talking about? A short, heavy silence hung on the line. When the woman spoke again, her voice was lower, steeped in the undeniable echo of old pain. Check the documents I just sent to your secure mail. But you have to be smart about this. He has eyes everywhere. He's always listening. How did you find me? Who are you? Someone who wouldn't let him erase me. Look at what I sent. Then we'll talk. The connection ended with a soft click, leaving Clara in a deafening silence, her heart pounding a violent rhythm against her ribs. With a shaking hand, she opened her encrypted email app. A new message waited. The subject line was blank. Inside, there was no greeting, just a secure download link and a single line of text below it. The key is my North Star. It was what Arthur used to call her in their early days. He ruined me too. You're not losing your mind. You are not alone. She tapped the link and entered the password. It unlocked a compressed file containing dozens of scanned documents. The first was a court order from 4 years ago, petitioning for a conservatorship. The subject's name was Catherine Reed. The petitioner was her business partner, Arthur Lexington, citing a severe psychotic break and dangerous corporate mismanagement. An emergency injunction. Clara's blood ran cold. Arthur had a business partner before he went solo. His mother once mentioned her in passing. A brilliant but unstable woman who had a breakdown and vanished after liquidating her shares. Such a shame, his mother had said with a dismissive wave. Some people just aren't built for the kind of pressure Arthur thrives on. But Catherine Reed hadn't just vanished. According to these documents, her own partner had used his connections to have her declared mentally unfit. She was held in a private facility for 3 months, heavily sedated, and legally blocked from contacting her lawyers or family. She was only released after she signed over her 50% stake in their company for a pittance and agreed to a non-disclosure agreement so restrictive it essentially erased her from the industry. After her release, she was gone. Clara swiped through the files, a cold dread coiling in her stomach with each new document. There were falsified psychiatric evaluations from doctors who sat on the boards of Arthur's other companies, bank transfers showing Arthur had emptied their joint venture accounts the day before the hearing, and sworn affidavits from employees that were clearly coerced and later sealed by a friendly judge. The final file was a draft of an email written by Catherine to a journalist, but never sent. He methodically convinced our entire circle I was unstable, it read. He had therapists on his payroll, investors who owed him, and a legal team that would bury anyone for a price. By the time I understood what was happening, it was over. He'd already stolen everything. My company, my reputation, my savings, my entire future. If you are reading this, it means he failed to break me completely. For God's sake, don't let him do this to anyone else. Clara looked at the date. 4 years ago. Catherine Reed had escaped the cage Arthur Lexington had engineered for her. She had survived. She had pulled herself back from the brink of total annihilation. And if Catherine could do that, so could Clara. She picked up her phone and dialed the private number. It answered on the very first ring. "Tell me everything," Clara said, her voice no longer a fragile whisper, but the sharp, clear crack of gathering ice. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her voice was solid. "Tell me everything." The woman on the other end now went by Hannah, a name she had chosen for herself. She had shed her former identity, Catherine Reed, like a skin she'd outgrown, leaving it in the past with everything else Arthur had poisoned. She told Clara she lived a quiet life now, in a small town in Vermont, a digital ghost who had scrubbed her existence from the web. It had taken her 4 years to rebuild her sanity, to learn to trust her own judgment again, to live a life that wasn't defined by his betrayal. But she never stopped watching him. She had built a sophisticated algorithm to monitor Arthur Lexington's financial and legal activities. When it flagged the aggressive legal maneuvers in his divorce, A pregnant wife being systematically isolated and stripped of her assets, she recognized the pattern instantly. She knew she couldn't remain a ghost any longer. "I've spent years creating a forensic map of his entire operation," Hannah said, her voice sharp with intent. "Documenting his methods, tracing the money, but I was just a discredited ex-partner. My word alone wasn't enough." "Why me?" Clara asked. "Because everyone else he betrayed, he bankrupted and buried with NDAs. You're the first person he couldn't control completely. I knew that if we combined what I know with what you're living through, we might finally have enough leverage to bring the entire empire down." Their initial call stretched past 3 hours. Hannah walked Clara through the labyrinth of evidence she'd compiled, the repeatable pattern of identifying a brilliant partner, exploiting their talent, and then engineering a crisis to seize control. "There was another one, a few years before me," Hannah explained, "a gifted urban planner named Marcus. Arthur lured him into a partnership, stole his designs for a major city project, and then framed him for taking bribes. And before Marcus, there was a software developer he dated in college. He stole her code for a logistics app and sold it. She tried to sue, and he ruined her reputation." "How many has he done this to?" Clara whispered, horrified. "That I can document with hard evidence? At least 4, but I'm sure the real number is higher." A wave of sickness washed over Clara. All those lives, all those careers destroyed, and Arthur had never faced a single consequence. His family's old money and legal firepower had insulated him, allowing him to turn his cruelty into a business strategy. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage. "We take this to the one person I know who has been trying to build a case against him for years." 2 days later, Clara was in a high-rise office in downtown Boston, sitting across from a man named David Chen. He was an assistant attorney general with piercing, intelligent eyes and the quiet intensity of a man who had seen the worst of Boston's elite and was thoroughly unimpressed by it. "Mrs. Lexington," Chen began, his tone professional but direct, "I've had an open investigation into your husband's business practices for 6 years. Bid rigging, illegal campaign financing, real estate fraud. But every time my office gets close, crucial evidence disappears, witnesses recant their testimony, and some very powerful people make phone calls on his behalf." "So you know he's a criminal?" "I know he operates like he's above the law, and I know he has a network that ensures he stays that way." "Then why hasn't he been stopped?" Chen leaned forward, his expression grim. "Because knowing a man is a predator and proving it beyond a reasonable doubt are 2 different worlds. I need someone from the inside, a witness with first-hand knowledge who is willing to go on the record. And up until now, everyone he's crossed has been too terrified to talk." Clara thought of her children, Ben and Lily, and the 2 sterile hours, a week she was permitted to be their mother. She thought of Amelia's smug smile at the last court date, her hand protectively on the stomach, carrying Arthur's next heir. "I'm not terrified anymore," Clara stated. The next 3 weeks were a blur of systematic preparation. David Chen's team of investigators worked with Hannah, cross-referencing her years of research with their own, building an ironclad timeline of corruption. Clara was equipped with a discreet audio recorder, a simple necklace to wear during her supervised visits, designed to capture Arthur's unguarded arrogance. The trap they conceived was devastatingly simple. Clara would be the one to initiate contact. She would call Arthur, her voice broken, begging for a final private meeting to sign whatever he wanted. His colossal ego would make it impossible for him to resist one last chance to see her defeated. And when he arrived, swaggering with triumph, anticipating the sight of a shattered woman pleading for scraps, he would find something else entirely waiting for him. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the penthouse of his newest skyscraper, a glittering monument to his own success in the Seaport district. Clara chose the location, aware of its state-of-the-art surveillance, and the floor-to-ceiling windows perfect for obscuring their own hidden cameras. She got there early, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, but her will was forged into something unbreakable. The private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Diaz, had the team set up in the restaurant's kitchen, monitoring audio and video from the private dining room. When Arthur Sterling strode through the door, he was precisely as she remembered, clad in a bespoke suit, radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable dominance. "You wanted a parley," he said, taking a seat as if he owned the entire establishment. "So speak." Clara sat across from him, her hands clasped on the table to hide their trembling. "I want to see my daughter," she said, her voice barely audible. "I miss her." "Then end this foolish crusade," he said smoothly. "Come back to the penthouse. Fulfill your duties." "My duties?" Arthur's smile was a weapon, the same one that had once charmed her into believing she was the center of his universe. Now she finally recognized its cold, predatory gleam. "You were never supposed to be a partner," he explained, as if to a child. "You were an asset, a brilliant hostess, a future mother, a wife who stayed out of my business affairs. But you became inquisitive, Clara. You started asking questions you had no right to ask, about things that don't concern you, and power is not something I delegate." Clara could feel the tiny recording device, taped beneath her dress, a small point of warmth against her skin, capturing every syllable. "What about Vantage Pharma?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Did that concern me?" The change in Arthur's posture was instantaneous. The polished veneer of civility cracked, revealing something frigid and dangerous beneath. "Where did you hear that name?" he whispered. "I found the offshore accounts, Arthur, the transfers. I know you shorted the stock." He leaned forward, his voice a venomous hiss. "The company was unstable just like you are now. It couldn't perform under pressure, so I facilitated its collapse. If you do not drop this, the very same thing will happen to you." "Is that a threat?" "It's a market forecast." Clara nodded once, very slowly. Then she looked directly at the centerpiece of flowers on the table, where she knew a pinhole camera was nestled among the lilies. "I believe that's everything the SEC will need," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. The dining room door swung inward. Federal marshals filled the doorway, and for the first time in his insulated life, Arthur Sterling looked completely and utterly stunned. The serving of the Wall Street titan with a civil RICO lawsuit was a tremor that shook the financial district. Business news channels broke into their regular programming as he was escorted from the five-star restaurant, his face a mixture of disbelief and incandescent rage. The footage went viral, ricocheting through every trading floor and investment group chat, endlessly dissected by analysts. Wall Street kingmaker sued by wife for racketeering. Sterling fund under federal investigation. More whistleblowers emerge in Sterling insider trading scandal. The list of allegations was breathtaking. Insider trading, wire fraud, market manipulation, and when one of Arthur's former analysts came forward with a cache of documents, followed by two junior traders Clara had never even met, the lawsuit morphed into a landmark case. It was no longer a domestic dispute. It was a public reckoning with corporate greed. Marcus had warned Clara that the legal war would be a slog, a brutal campaign of motions and depositions, and that Arthur's army of lawyers would scorch the earth to protect him. But some battles were won quickly. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, Serena Vance was caught by reporters leaving a pawn shop, having tried to sell a six-figure watch Arthur had gifted her. An emergency injunction froze every asset he had ever put in her name. Her influencer career, built on a brand of empowered female finance, secretly bankrolled by Arthur, imploded in a storm of online mockery. Her tearful, makeup-smeared apology video became a legendary meme, a perfect symbol of her spectacular fall from grace. The charity initiative she had so triumphantly announced to the press? It was a shell corporation for laundering money, as revealed by forensic accountants. Eleanor Sterling, Arthur's imperious mother, found herself a pariah in the Upper East Side society she once ruled. The boards of the opera and the ballet politely requested her resignation, and friends who had once vied for a place at her dinner table were suddenly unavailable. The Sterling name, once a password to the most exclusive rooms in New York, was now toxic. For Clara, though, the only victory that mattered came 6 weeks later, in a New York family courtroom that was a universe away from the penthouse where her life had been torn apart. A pragmatic judge with sharp, discerning eyes presided. She had reviewed the mountain of evidence, listened to the damning recordings from the restaurant, and read the reports from federal investigators. Then she gave her ruling. Sole legal and physical custody of the infant child, Maya Hayes, is hereby awarded to her mother, Clara Hayes. Mr. Arthur Sterling is denied all contact pending the outcome of the federal criminal investigation. Furthermore, this court finds Mr. Sterling in breach of the prenuptial agreement through acts of gross financial malfeasance, thereby rendering it void and awarding the petitioner significant compensatory damages and control of all primary marital assets. Clara felt the words wash over her. Sole custody, assets secured. She had won. Marcus squeezed her arm, the pressure a welcome anchor to reality. The conference room was buzzing with tension, but Ava's attention was fixed on a door, where a paralegal was leading in a small boy. Noah spotted her first. His little face erupted into a joyful grin, and he started to pull away, reaching for her with his entire body. "Mommy!" he yelled. "Mommy!" It was the sound she had been starved of. He chanted it like a magic word. "Mommy! Mommy! Mommy!" In an instant, Ava was on her feet and crossing the floor, collapsing to her knees to wrap her son in her arms. A sob breaking free from a place so deep inside her, she felt it might shatter her ribs. Lily, her newborn daughter, stirred in the carrier beside her as Noah buried his head into his mother's shoulder, his tiny hands clutching her sweater. "I'm here," Ava whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I am right here now, and I am never going to be gone again." The months that followed were a reconstruction, because healing is always work. Ava moved to a small bungalow in Portland, far from the ghosts of Seattle. She invested her settlement in a charming, run-down diner, a world away from the glass and steel restaurants of her past, but it was finally wholly hers. She returned to her first love, using her culinary talents to launch a business helping domestic violence shelters host empowering fundraising galas. The work was not glamorous, and it certainly didn't offer the perks of Arthur's world, but it had purpose. The baby, a bright little girl named Maya, thrived. She took her first confident steps on the sun-drenched wood floors of their new home. Her favorite word became more, usually in reference to stories or cuddles. In a house filled with laughter instead of tense silence, she grew into a happy, secure little girl who knew she was loved. Clara still had moments of panic, triggered by the sharp ring of a phone or the sight of a man in a pinstripe suit. She still flinched at the sound of a raised voice. She still saw Arthur's dismissive smile in her nightmares sometimes, but she was healing, one client at a time, one bedtime story at a time. One sunny spring afternoon, sitting on a bench in Prospect Park while Maya chased pigeons, a man in a casual jacket sat down nearby, pulling out a sketch pad. His name was Daniel, an architect with a kind face, and a son, Leo, who was a few years older than Maya. He was there sketching ideas for a new community pavilion. He didn't ask why she seemed so guarded. He didn't offer platitudes or try to fix her. He just sketched, showed Maya how to draw a surprisingly realistic-looking dog, and asked if he could buy her a coffee from the cart near the entrance. "I'd like that," Clara said, and for the first time in years, the words felt uncomplicated and true. Her phone buzzed with an alert from a news app. She glanced at the screen and felt a quiet, settled calm. Arthur Sterling permanently barred from securities industry, fined $50 million. She put the phone away and looked back at her daughter, at the park, at the man waiting for her with 2 paper cups and a patient smile. He had taken so much from her, she thought. Her trust, her financial independence, her vision of the life they were supposed to have. But he could not take this. He could not take her fire. Her business partner gave a thumbs up from his delivery van, and Noah waved from the porch steps. Lily toddled across the lawn, her tiny fists clutching a fallen crimson maple leaf. "Mama," she said, holding it up as though it were a rare jewel. "So pretty." Her face was a perfect portrait of awe, and Ava felt something click into place within her spirit. Not a noisy triumph, but a quiet, powerful sense of peace. She knelt and took the leaf from her daughter's fingers. "It is breathtaking," she whispered. "Let's go find a whole bouquet for the tables." Together, they walked deeper into the neighborhood garden, their hands joined. The morning sun was brilliant. The future was an unwritten menu. And for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, Chef Ava Rostova was not afraid of what she would create next.